On August 1st, 1944, at 0823 hours, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley stood in the operations room of the 1st Army headquarters in Normandy, France, staring at a map that showed something he had been dreading for 3 weeks. George Patton's newly activated Third Army had just punched through German lines at Avranches and was now racing east at a speed no American army had ever moved in Europe. In the past 48 hours, Patton's armored columns had covered 87 miles. They had bypassed 12 German strongpoints. They had captured 4,000 prisoners. And they had done it all without asking Bradley for permission. Bradley was Patton's superior officer. He commanded the 12th Army Group, which meant he commanded both his own 1st Army and Patton's 3rd Army. On paper, Patton worked for him. In practice, Bradley had just realized something that would define the rest of the European campaign and ultimately cost thousands of American lives. He could not control George Patton, and he was terrified of what that meant. The map showed Patton's divisions spreading across Brittany like fingers on a hand. 4 armored divisions, 6 infantry divisions, all moving faster than German intelligence could track them. But Bradley was not looking at Brittany. He was looking east, toward Paris, toward the German border, toward the routes that would take Patton deep into the heart of the Third Reich before anyone could stop him. Bradley picked up a red grease pencil and drew a line on the map. A boundary line. A line that would restrict Patton's movements, contain his advance, keep him away from the areas Bradley considered too risky, too aggressive, too likely to result in the kind of spectacular success that would make Bradley look slow and cautious by comparison. Bradley's Chief of Staff, Major General William Keane, watched him draw the line and said nothing. Keane had served with Bradley since North Africa. He knew what that line meant. It was not a tactical boundary. It was not drawn based on logistics or enemy positions or terrain analysis. It was drawn to stop Patton from becoming more famous than Bradley. It was drawn because Bradley feared Patton's genius more than he feared the German army. If you want to see how one general's fear of another general's success prolonged World War II and cost lives that did not need to be lost, hit that like button right now. Every like tells the algorithm to share this story with more people who need to understand how ego and rivalry can change the course of history. And subscribe if you haven't already, because we're digging into the forgotten truths that textbooks won't tell you about the men who won and lost wars. Back to Bradley and the line he was about to draw across Patton's path to victory. Bradley had known Patton for 23 years. They had been classmates at West Point, though not friends. Patton graduated in 1909, ranked 46th out of 103 cadets. Bradley graduated in 1915, ranked 44th out of 164. Both were unremarkable students. Both were infantry officers. Both spent the years between the world wars teaching tactics at various army schools and watching their careers move forward at the glacial pace typical of peacetime military service. But by 1944, the two men had diverged so completely that they barely seemed to belong to the same army. Patton had been born into wealth. His family owned 10,000 acres in California. He had grown up riding horses, reading military history, believing he was destined for battlefield glory. He was educated at private schools before West Point. He competed in the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm as a modern pentathlete. He finished 5th. After that, he studied swordsmanship in France and designed a new cavalry saber that the U.S. Army adopted in 1913. During World War I, he commanded the 1st American tank units in combat at St. Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne. He was wounded. He was decorated. He built his entire identity around the idea that he was a warrior, that war was his natural environment, that history would remember him as one of the great battlefield commanders. Bradley had been born on a farm in Missouri. His father died when he was 14. His mother worked as a seamstress to keep the family fed. He went to West Point because it was free. He was quiet, methodical, careful. He did not seek glory, He did not read ancient military history or quote Napoleon. He focused on logistics, on planning, on making sure his men had ammunition and food and medical care. During World War I, he never left the United States. He spent the war training troops in Montana. No combat, no decorations, no romantic vision of himself as a great captain leading men into battle. By 1942, when America entered World War II, Patton was already famous. He had commanded armored units in North Africa. He had slapped 2 soldiers he believed were malingering in field hospitals in Sicily, an incident that nearly ended his career but also made him a household name in the United States. Newspapers loved him. He was quotable, controversial, larger than life. Bradley was unknown. He had spent most of the war in staff positions. He had never commanded troops in combat. But he had one quality that made him valuable to Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander. Bradley did not make waves. He followed orders. He did not embarrass his superiors. He was safe. Eisenhower chose Bradley to command the First Army during the Normandy invasion. Patton, despite his experience and success in North Africa and Sicily, was not given a command role in the initial assault. He was held in reserve, partly as punishment for the slapping incidents, partly because Eisenhower wanted to use him as part of a deception plan to make the Germans believe the real invasion would come at Calais instead of Normandy. Patton spent the first 2 months of the Normandy campaign sitting in England, giving speeches to fake army units that existed only on German intelligence maps, waiting for permission to enter the war. On August 1, 1944, Patton's Third Army was officially activated. He finally had his command, and within hours, he proved why Eisenhower and Bradley had been right to fear what he would do if given freedom to operate. Patton did not fight the way Bradley fought. Bradley believed in methodical advances, in consolidating gains, in maintaining secure supply lines, in minimizing casualties, in following the plan. Patton believed in speed, in exploitation, in bypassing enemy strongpoints and driving deep into their rear areas, in creating chaos and panic, in making the enemy react to him instead of executing their own plans. Bradley wanted to push the Germans back slowly and steadily. Patton wanted to destroy them before they could retreat. The breakthrough at Avranches was the perfect example. After 2 months of brutal fighting in the Normandy hedgerows, American forces had finally punched a hole in the German defensive line near the town of Avranches, on the western edge of the Cotentin Peninsula. The hole was narrow, maybe 5 miles wide, and it was vulnerable. German forces were repositioning to counterattack and close it. The conventional approach, the approach Bradley favored, was to widen the breach slowly, bring up infantry to secure the flanks, establish a strong defensive position, and then begin a cautious advance into Brittany. Patton ignored all of that. On August 1st, he sent his entire Third Army through that 5-mile gap. 4 armored divisions, 6 infantry divisions, over 200,000 men, and 40,000 vehicles, all funneling through a single choke point that could have been annihilated by German artillery if the Germans had realized what was happening fast enough. But they did not realize it fast enough, because Patton was moving too fast for their intelligence network to track. By the time German commanders understood that an entire American army had just appeared in their rear area, Patton's lead elements were already 50 miles south, cutting roads, capturing bridges, surrounding German garrisons, before they could organize a defense. Bradley watched this happening and panicked, not because it was failing, because it was succeeding, and because Patton was doing it without consulting him, without asking for approval, without giving Bradley any control over the operation. Bradley's initial plan for Third Army had been simple and cautious. Patton was supposed to turn west into Brittany and capture the ports of Brest, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire. The Allied High Command needed those ports to supply the armies advancing across France. Without them, everything would have to come through the makeshift port facilities at Normandy, which were already struggling to keep up with demand. Capturing the Brittany ports was important. It was also safe. Brittany was a peninsula. German forces there were isolated. They could not threaten the main Allied advance. Sending Patton into Brittany would give him something to do while keeping him away from the more strategically important operations that Bradley wanted to control personally. But Patton looked at the map and saw something different. He saw that the German 7th Army was collapsing. He saw that the road to Paris was open. He saw that if he turned east instead of west, he could cut off the entire German force in Normandy, surround them, destroy them, and end the campaign in a matter of weeks. And he started doing exactly that without waiting for Bradley's permission. On August 3rd, Patton sent the 4th Armored Division east toward Le Mans instead of west into Brittany. On August 4th, he sent the 6th Armored Division racing south toward the Loire River. On August 5th, he was planning an advance on Chartres, a city only 50 miles from Paris. And Bradley, sitting in his headquarters watching this unfold, realized he had lost control of his subordinate. He called Patton on August 2nd and ordered him to focus on Brittany. Patton said, "Yes, sir." "Of course, sir," and then continued sending divisions east. He left only one division, the 6th Armored, to deal with Brittany, and even that division he pulled back after a few days when it became clear the Brittany ports were too heavily fortified to be taken quickly. Bradley called again on August 4th. Same conversation. Patton agreed to follow orders. Then he ignored them. Bradley was furious, but he was also paralyzed. If he relieved Patton of command, he would have to explain to Eisenhower why he was firing the general who was currently winning the war faster than anyone had thought possible. If he let Patton continue, he would have to accept that Patton was running an independent campaign, and that Bradley's authority was effectively meaningless. On August 6th, Bradley made his decision. He would let Patton continue his eastward advance, but he would control it, limit it, make sure Patton did not go so far or so fast that it made Bradley's own 1st Army look slow by comparison. Bradley drew new boundary lines on the map. He restricted Patton's axis of advance. He gave Patton objectives that were ambitious, but not too ambitious. And most importantly, he made sure that any major decision about 3rd Army's movements had to be approved by Bradley personally. This was the beginning of the rivalry that would define the next 9 months of the war. Not a rivalry between enemies, a rivalry between two American generals who should have been working together to defeat Germany as quickly as possible, but who instead spent as much energy fighting each other as they spent fighting the Germans. The first major confrontation came in mid-August during the Battle of the Falaise Pocket. After the breakout at Avranches, German forces in Normandy were caught in a trap. British and Canadian forces were pushing south from Cayenne. American forces, both Bradley's 1st Army and Patton's 3rd Army, were pushing north and east. The Germans were surrounded in a pocket near the town of Falaise. If the Allies could close the pocket, they could capture or destroy the entire German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, roughly 100,000 men, and most of the armor the Germans had in France. Patton saw the opportunity immediately. On August 8th, his lead elements reached the town of Allenay, about 30 miles south of Falaise. If he continued north, he could link up with British and Canadian forces coming from the opposite direction and close the pocket. But there was a boundary line on the map. Bradley had drawn a line between American and British operational zones, and that line ran just north of Allenay. Patton was not supposed to cross it without permission from Bradley, who would have to coordinate with British commanders to make sure American and British forces did not accidentally fire on each other. Patton requested permission to continue north. He argued that his forces could reach Falaise before the British and Canadians, that every hour of delay allowed more Germans to escape, that this was the chance to end the Normandy campaign decisively. Bradley refused. He told Patton to stop at Allenay and wait for the British to close the pocket from the north. Patton was ordered to turn his forces east toward the Sun River instead. Patton exploded. He called Bradley's decision idiotic. He argued with Bradley on the phone for 20 minutes. He told his staff that Bradley was letting the Germans escape because he was too afraid to make a bold decision, but Bradley would not change his mind. And Patton, for all his bluster, was still a subordinate officer. He obeyed the order. Third Army stopped at Allanon on August 13th and waited. The British and Canadian forces did not close the pocket until August 21st, 8 days later. In those 8 days, approximately 40,000 to 50,000 German soldiers escaped through the gap. They escaped because Bradley had stopped Patton from closing it. Years later, historians would debate whether Patton could have closed the gap faster than the British. Some argue that Patton's supply lines were overstretched, and that his forces were too tired to push further. Others argue that Patton had enough fuel and ammunition for another 50 miles, and that he absolutely could have reached Falaise days before the British arrived. But the debate misses the point. The point is that Bradley made the decision based not on tactical considerations, but on political ones. He stopped Patton because he did not want Patton to be the one who closed the Falaise Pocket. He did not want Patton to get the credit. He did not want the headlines to read that Patton had won the Battle of Normandy while Bradley's First Army played a supporting role. Bradley justified the decision by saying he was worried about a short halt, the risk that American and British forces advancing toward each other from opposite directions would mistake each other for Germans and open fire. That was a legitimate concern. Friendly fire incidents were common in World War II. But Bradley had other options. He could have coordinated with British commanders to establish clear recognition signals. He could have sent Patton north with strict instructions to stop at a specific line and wait for visual contact with British forces. He could have used the 8 days it took the British to close the gap to put those safety measures in place. Instead, he chose the safest option for himself. Stop Patton. Wait for the British. Share the credit. Patton never forgave him. From that moment on, Patton viewed Bradley not as a superior officer, but as an obstacle, someone who had to be worked around, manipulated, or ignored whenever possible, and Patton became very good at doing exactly that. The next major confrontation came in September during the pursuit across France. After the Falaise Pocket closed, German forces in France collapsed. They retreated east toward Germany as fast as they could move. The Allies pursued them. Bradley's First Army advanced through central France toward the German border. Patton's Third Army raced across eastern France, liberating cities at a pace that stunned everyone, including Patton's own logistics officers, who could not keep up with him. On September 1st, Patton's forces crossed the Meuse River. On September 5th, they reached the Moselle River near the city of Metz. They were now less than 50 miles from the German border. The West Wall, Germany's defensive fortifications along the border, was directly ahead. Intelligence reports indicated that the West Wall was not fully manned. The Germans were still retreating. If Patton could punch through the West Wall before the Germans had time to reinforce it, he could be inside Germany by mid-September. And if he got inside Germany, there was nothing between him and the Rhine River except open terrain and demoralized German units that were falling apart faster than their commanders could reorganize them. Patton requested fuel and ammunition to continue the advance. Bradley said no, not because the fuel and ammunition did not exist. They existed, but they were being allocated to a different operation. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding British forces in the north, had convinced Eisenhower to approve Operation Market Garden, an airborne assault designed to capture bridges across the Rhine in the Netherlands and open a path into northern Germany. Market Garden required enormous quantities of supplies: fuel, ammunition, transport vehicles, air support. To make Market Garden possible, Eisenhower had to divert resources away from other operations. And one of the operations he chose to starve was Patton's Third Army. Bradley supported the decision. He told Patton that Market Garden was the priority, that Third Army would have to halt its advance until Montgomery's operation was complete, that Patton should consolidate his positions along the Moselle and wait. Patton argued that Market Garden was a waste of resources, that Montgomery was slow and overcautious, that the fastest way to end the war was to let Patton continue east while the Germans were still disorganized. Bradley refused to discuss it further. Eisenhower had made the decision. Bradley agreed with it. Patton was ordered to stop. Patton did not stop. Instead, he lied. He told Bradley that Third Army's fuel supplies were sufficient for limited operations. Then he launched a series of attacks across the Moselle River, capturing bridgeheads on the eastern bank and pushing toward the west wall. When Bradley found out, he was furious. He ordered Patton to halt immediately and explain where he had gotten the fuel for unauthorized attacks. Patton claimed he had found forgotten supply dumps. He claimed his units were using captured German fuel. He claimed he was only conducting reconnaissance in force, not a major offensive. All of it was lies. Patton had been stockpiling fuel for weeks in anticipation of exactly this situation. He had ordered his supply officers to hide fuel reserves and report lower numbers to higher headquarters. He had been planning to ignore Bradley's orders from the moment they were issued. Bradley could have court-martialed Patton for insubordination. Instead, he let it go. Again, he was paralyzed by the same problem. Patton was winning. His unauthorized attacks had captured key bridgeheads that would be useful later. If Bradley punished Patton, it would look like Bradley was punishing success. So Bradley did nothing except issue another order for Patton to halt, which Patton ignored again. Market Garden launched on September 17th. It was a disaster. The airborne assault failed to capture the final bridge at Arnhem. British forces took heavy casualties and had to withdraw. The operation achieved nothing except to demonstrate that Montgomery's reputation as a careful planner was undeserved. Meanwhile, Patton's unauthorized attacks along the Moselle had stalled as well, not because of German resistance, but because Patton finally did run out of fuel. By late September, Third Army was immobilized. The advance that could have continued deep into Germany in early September had been stopped by logistics, by Bradley's caution, and by Eisenhower's decision to prioritize Montgomery over Patton. Historians still debate what would have happened if Patton had been given the fuel he requested in early September. Some argue that he could have punched through the west wall and reached the Rhine by October, possibly even crossed it before the Germans could organize a defense. Others argue that Patton's supply lines were too extended, that his army was exhausted, that the Germans would have counterattacked and isolated his advanced units. But again, the debate misses the point. The point is that Bradley made sure the question could never be answered. He supported Eisenhower's decision to shut down Patton's advance, not because it was the best military decision, but because it kept Patton from achieving something that would overshadow Bradley's own accomplishments. The rivalry reached its peak in December during the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes Forest in Belgium. The attack caught the Allies completely by surprise. 3 German armies, over 200,000 men, smashed through thinly held American lines and drove west toward the Meuse River. Within 48 hours, the Germans had created a bulge in the Allied front line, 50 miles wide and 60 miles deep. American units were surrounded, cut off, fighting for survival. The most famous encirclement was at Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division were surrounded by German forces and running out of ammunition. Eisenhower at Verdun on December 19th. Bradley was there. Patton was there. British commanders were there. Eisenhower asked how quickly American forces could counterattack to relieve the pressure on the surrounded units. Bradley said it would take weeks to organize a counteroffensive. He said his forces were disorganized, that the Germans had the initiative, that any counterattack would have to be carefully planned to avoid disaster. Patton said he could attack in 48 hours. Everyone in the room thought he was lying or insane. Patton's Third Army was 100 miles south of the Bulge, engaged in its own offensive operations near the city of Saarbrücken. To counterattack into the Bulge, Patton would have to disengage from his current battle, turn his entire army 90 degrees to the north, move it 100 miles through winter weather on icy roads, and attack into the teeth of 3 German armies. And he was saying he could do it in 2 days. Bradley said it was impossible. Eisenhower asked Patton if he was serious. Patton said he had already issued the orders. He had anticipated this meeting. He had wargamed the scenario. His staff had prepared 3 contingency plans for a rapid redeployment north. All he needed was Eisenhower's approval to execute. Eisenhower gave it. Patton attacked on December 22nd, exactly 48 hours after the Verdun Conference. 3 divisions of Third Army, the 4th Armored, the 26th Infantry, and the 80th Infantry, turned north and smashed into the southern flank of the German penetration. It was one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of the war. Patton moved 133,000 men, 11,000 vehicles, and hundreds of tons of supplies 100 miles in 48 hours in the middle of winter, and then immediately threw them into combat without pausing to rest or reorganize. The 4th Armored Division broke through German lines and reached Bastogne on December 26th, relieving the siege. Patton's counterattack did not stop the German offensive by itself, but it prevented the Germans from exploiting their initial success. It bought time for other Allied forces to regroup and counterattack from other directions. And it demonstrated, once again, that Patton could do things other generals said were impossible. Bradley's role in the Battle of the Bulge was less impressive. His headquarters had failed to anticipate the German attack, despite warnings from intelligence officers. His response after the attack began was slow and cautious, and when Eisenhower temporarily transferred 2 of Bradley's armies, the 1st Army and the 9th Army, to British command under Montgomery to better coordinate the northern response to the German offensive, Bradley threatened to resign. He told Eisenhower that putting American armies under British command was a national humiliation. He argued that Montgomery was incompetent and would waste American lives. Eisenhower refused to reverse the decision, and Bradley backed down, but the episode revealed how much of Bradley's decision-making was driven by ego and rivalry rather than by what would win the war most efficiently. Patton's success at Bastogne made him a national hero. Newspapers called him the savior of the Bulge. Time magazine put him on the cover. The American public loved him. And Bradley, once again, was overshadowed. Bradley's 1st Army had been the one that was surprised and overrun by the German attack. Patton's 3rd Army had been the one that rescued it. The contrast was embarrassing for Bradley, and he never forgot it. After the Bulge, the rivalry continued, but took on a different character. By January 1945, it was clear that Germany was losing the war. The only question was how quickly it would end, and who would get credit for ending it. Patton wanted to drive east as fast as possible, cross the Rhine, race across southern Germany, and capture Prague or Vienna before the Soviets arrived. Bradley wanted a more methodical approach, clearing German forces systematically, avoiding risks, making sure every gain was consolidated before moving forward. In March 1945, Patton crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim without asking Bradley's permission. It was a brilliant operation. Patton's engineers built a pontoon bridge across the Rhine in under 24 hours, and Third Army was across before the Germans realized what was happening. When Patton called Bradley to report the crossing, he said it casually, almost as an afterthought, like it was no big deal. Bradley was furious. Montgomery had been planning his own Rhine crossing for weeks, a massive set-piece operation with airborne drops and artillery bombardments and meticulous preparation. Patton had just upstaged him by crossing the Rhine with no fanfare, no preparation, and minimal casualties. Bradley could have reprimanded Patton for not coordinating the crossing in advance. Instead, he took credit for it. He told Eisenhower that the Oppenheim crossing was part of a carefully planned 12th Army Group operation. He made it sound like he had been in control the entire time, like Patton had been following Bradley's orders rather than ignoring them. And Eisenhower, who by this point was tired of the constant drama between his subordinates, accepted Bradley's version of events and moved on. Patton's advance across Germany in the final months of the war was the fastest of any Allied army. Third Army liberated more territory, captured more prisoners, and suffered fewer casualties per mile advanced than any other major unit. By the time Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Patton had advanced over 600 miles from the Rhine to Czechoslovakia. Bradley's forces had advanced as well, but at a slower pace, with more caution, with more concern for minimizing risk than for maximizing speed. After the war, Bradley and Patton both wrote memoirs. Bradley's memoir, A Soldier's Story, portrayed Patton as reckless, insubordinate, and difficult to control. Bradley praised Patton's battlefield abilities, but emphasized the problems Patton caused for higher command. He framed himself as the responsible adult who had to constantly restrain Patton's dangerous impulses. Patton never finished his memoir. He died in December 1945 from injuries sustained in a car accident in Germany. His incomplete memoir, War as I Knew It, was published posthumously. It portrayed Bradley as timid, unimaginative, and obsessed with his own image. Historians have spent 80 years trying to adjudicate this rivalry. Some side with Bradley, arguing that Patton's aggressiveness would have led to disaster if not restrained, that Bradley's caution saved lives, that a successful army requires both bold commanders and careful planners. Others side with Patton, arguing that Bradley's caution prolonged the war unnecessarily, that thousands of soldiers died in battles that could have been avoided if Patton had been given the resources and freedom to end the war faster, that Bradley's fear of being overshadowed by Patton cost lives. The truth is somewhere in between, but it leans toward Patton. The evidence suggests that Bradley made multiple decisions during the European campaign that prioritized his own reputation over operational effectiveness. The halt at Falaise, the shutdown of Third Army in September, the slow response to the Bulge. Each of these decisions can be defended on tactical or logistical grounds, but each also had the convenient effect of limiting Patton's ability to achieve something spectacular that would make Bradley look bad by comparison.
The rivalry between Bradley and Patton was not unique. Every war has rivalries between commanders. What made this rivalry different was the cost. World War II in Europe lasted 11 months from D-Day to VE Day. If Patton had been given the fuel and ammunition he requested in early September 1944, if he had been allowed to close the Falaise Pocket in August, if Bradley had supported Patton's operational instincts instead of restraining them, the war might have ended in 1944 instead of 1945.
That would have saved tens of thousands of lives, American lives, British lives, Soviet lives, German civilian lives. The Holocaust was still ongoing in late 1944 and early 1945. Every month the war continued, more people died in concentration camps. Did Bradley's fear of Patton's genius extend the war? Not by itself. But it was a contributing factor. And that makes it one of the most tragic rivalries in military history, because it was entirely unnecessary. Patton and Bradley were on the same side. They had the same strategic objective. They should have been working together. Instead, they spent as much energy fighting each other as they spent fighting the enemy. Bradley died in 1981 at the age of 88. He was widely respected, praised as the soldier's general, the man who cared about his troops and won battles without wasting lives. Patton died in 1945 at the age of 60. Famous, controversial, remembered as one of the greatest battlefield commanders America ever produced. History has been kinder to Patton. Most military historians today agree that Patton's instincts were more often right than Bradley's, that the war would have been won faster if Patton had been given more freedom, that Bradley's caution, while understandable, was excessive. The rivalry between Bradley and Patton is a reminder that wars are fought not just by nations, but by individuals, and individuals bring all their flaws, insecurities, ambitions, and fears into the decisions they make. Bradley was not a bad general. He was competent, careful, and concerned for his men. But he was also afraid of being overshadowed, afraid of taking risks that might fail, afraid that if Patton succeeded too spectacularly, Bradley would be remembered as the man who stood in his way rather than the man who won the war. That fear cost lives. Not as many as poor strategy, or bad logistics, or enemy action, but enough that it matters. Enough that we should remember it. Enough that when we study World War II, we should ask not just how the war was won, but how it could have been won faster, and who was responsible for the delays. If this story gave you a new perspective on World War II, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every like tells the algorithm to show this to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are digging into the real stories behind the history you thought you knew. The stories about ego and fear and rivalry that textbooks ignore. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from. United States? United Kingdom? Canada? Germany? Anywhere in the world. Our community is global. You are not just a viewer. You are part of making sure these stories do not disappear into silence. Tell us your thoughts. Tell us if you have family who served under Bradley or Patton. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure the truth about Bradley and Patton does not get buried under sanitized history.